What's good, party people? This is According to Woods, and this is a kind of a historic episode of According to Woods because as of this morning, the UFC and the WWE are under one umbrella. This is pretty unprecedented, and I just kind of want to talk to you, get your thoughts on things. But my goodness, I mean, literally less than 24 hours after WrestleMania 39, Night 2 concludes, we get this historic announcement that Endevor has purchased 51% of the WWE, right? And Endevor is already the one of the largest talent agencies in Hollywood that acquired the UFC not too long ago, less than 10 years ago. And I believe it was 2017, right after UFC 200, right? The UFC at the time's version of WrestleMania. So, I mean, they're kind of on the same page in terms of their acquisition strategy, and that being Endevor. But my goodness, this is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. So I'm going to talk. So what we know now, right, is Endevor, right, the talent agency that also owns the UFC, as previously stated, basically purchased 51% of the WWE to create this new company under the umbrella, the Endevor banner, and that is going to include UFC and WWE. Now, in terms of the 51%, for those who don't know, the 51% of the WWE that was offered up to Endevor was essentially Vince McMahon's shares. And this is shares that he's retained since the company went public in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, my goodness, it sorry, dogs barking. But yeah, it's unfathomable. This is interest that Vince McMahon himself has had in the company since, I mean, his grandfather. We're talking pre WWF and Vince Sr., but, Jess McMahon, who promoted wrestling and boxing in, the Northeast, and that's literally how the McMahons start in combat sports, what I refer to as combat sports, because anything in a ring or a cage, I think it all relates. That's just me, but I've been refuted. But I think a day like today, it's no more evident than right now that it's all one umbrella, and it's kind of crazy, right? Throughout the course of my career, 6-year career, I've done MMA mostly, doing interviews and podcasts in the Southern California region, right? And then later MMA. I mean, later pro wrestling, I should say. So I have been told personally in my career that no, you have to pick a lane. You have to either do MMA because MMA fans don't like wrestling and pro wrestling fans don't like MMA. So you can't do both. But we've seen different iterations of such when you see an Era Hawani, interview, people from both realms in terms of the wrestling space as well as the combat sports space. You also have Joe Rogan. All right, Joe Rogan has interviewed the likes of Diamond Dallas Page, Jake the Snake Roberts, and The Undertaker, where a lot of pro wrestling people weren't getting interviews with Taker. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit more common now. Also, guys like Chris Van Vliet, and to a local extent, like Eddie Torres of the Rock and Roll Beer Guy podcast. He does what he wants, right? So he does MMA, pro wrestling, and a bunch of metal. So shoot him a follow. But my goodness, I'm gonna, I guess, take comments. Alex Ramirez says Matt Riddle has to wake up this morning and find out that Dana White is his boss again. I wouldn't necessarily say that, right? Because again, I think Vince McMahon is going to have um, some stake in the company, right? I think it'll be similar to maybe the the Ted Turner acquisition of Jim Crockett Promotions, right? And they said, hey, we're not buying the company unless Ric Flair comes along. I think it's going to be something pretty similar to such. And, Vince is going to stay on as long as he's able to or contractually obligated to. And this is very similar of the UFC's kind of I guess, Endeavor's ownership of the UFC, where they retained Dana White as their UFC president. Although the Fertitta brothers pretty much left the company, they accepted the buyout, and Dana, to an extent, had whatever shares that he had in Zuffa, UFC's former parent company under the Fertittas. He basically, whatever shares that he had, he also offered it up. So it was a total control takeover of the and buyout, a total buyout of the UFC. This one regarding the WWE purchase, it was basically 51%. So this is Vince McMahon selling his personal shares in the company, so there's a lot of things to kind of juggle, right? Because Endevor, this kind of conglomerate, is a publicly traded company, as is the WWE. So are we going to see a merger of both stocks? Because that was something that Vince McMahon himself, when he was on CNBC this morning, and the interview, the way that it felt to me, it was taken right before one of the nights before Mania and kind of kept under lock and key up until we, this news, right? And again, it feels very much reminiscent to UFC 200, right? And that was the last pay per view of the Zuffa era. And then we found out pretty much within, I believe it was 24 hours, pretty soon after UFC 200, that, the UFC had been acquired, so that's that. Over on Instagram, Relentless Pro Wrestling said the UFC is the best pro wrestling promotion in the world in recent years. And he, of course, refers to their promo and fight production field, and that's something that has been echoed in terms of guys like Jim Cornette and Bret Hart. They've said, like, the UFC is doing what wrestling used to do and catering to the audience that wrestling used to cater to in bygone eras of the 50s and the 70s here in the United States. So there's that. And perhaps we can entertain the idea of Brock Lesnar versus John Jones. If that happens, it's probably going to take place on an island where there's no regulated testing, which that's another thing too, right? Because the obviously during the pandemic and lockdowns, we basically saw UFC have fights in the Middle East, right? I believe it was in Abu Dhabi, right? And they basically held Fight Island overseas in the Middle East, right? Uh, Vince McMahon and the WWE actually have a working relationship with the Saudi government to produce, I believe it's like 4 shows a year, 2 to 4 shows a year over, I believe, 5 or 10 years. So they individually have their own, relationship with the Saudi government. And it's funny because when the first inkling of WWE potentially being sold, it kind of broke the internet. Everybody thought it was going to be the Saudis, right? So yeah, it wasn't the Saudis at all, but again, both companies individually have their own personal relationships with the Saudis. So I don't know how that's going to work. I don't know how the stock mergers are going to work. I don't know how they're going to rectify if you are a shareholder of both WWE or Endeavor, or individually a shareholder of the WWE and or Endeavor. Does your two stocks become whole? Like if you hold a share in one of each company, right? Do they merge the stocks, right? And again, 49%. I would think the remaining 49% of the company are the shares of the shareholder that the WWE couldn't fold. And it's kind of weird, right? Because Dana White and Vince McMahon over the last year have not had the grace of the pop culture lexicon, right? Dana White during New Year's in Mexico had assaulted his wife, right? And not and this is at the same time that essentially what ends up happening is Dana White is promoting a slap fight league, right? And he slaps his wife, so there's that. And then obviously the thing that caused Vince McMahon to basically take a leave of absence. He said he was retired, but that didn't, I mean, pro wrestling, right? Like, he didn't actually retire. So, with that all being said, um, you know, Vince is back. And, he being Vince was basically threatening a sale or the potential sale, um, as a way to kind of negate his kind of ousting of the company, right? And there have been people who have gone, oh well, let's, you know what, we're going to sell the company, or Vince is a bad deal, the roster pretty much almost unanimously just like love the idea that Vince was gone, right? And even Nick Khan to an extent, we're talking about, Nick, the I think it was right around Christmas time, 2022, that Vince was trying to make inroads back in with the company, and he was with the board of directors that were there at the time, who are no longer there, mind you, basically put the kibosh on a Vince comeback, right? So, um, Vince has 51% of the company, and he's just like, well, anything that happens, if you're not letting me back in, well, guess what? I'm thwarting any plans that you have with my company. So it's just crazy. I think it's amazing. It's unprecedented, right? And that word is going to be used a lot. So get used to it over this next week, right? Because Aria Emanuel, the person, if you love the Entourage series on HBO, well, Aria Emanuel is basically the source of Jeremy Piven's character in Entourage. That was Aria Emanuel, right? And then that guy is essentially Vince McMahon and Dana White's boss. This is nuts, right? Like, it's it's crazy. And again, I kind of thought, right, when the kind of illusions of a sale happening, right? I was like, learning from the UFC way of doing things. Again, the UFC was sold right after their banner UFC 200 pay per view that saw Brock Lesnar come back from the WWE looking like Goro, shredded on every supplement known to man. It looked like, and face make Mark Hunt, right? And it was a fight that ended up in a legal litigation, and I guess the resignment of Mark Hunt in the UFC, a K1 great, a Pride great, and what have you. And that fight that Brock won on that night was later forced to a no contest due to the fact that Brock Lesnar tested way hot for his USADA testing. So, and they knew that beforehand, right? There are things that I saw on the internet, on the socials, about people essentially. Roman Reigns retained last night, and I was fortunate enough to be there at WrestleMania night 2 and night 1 as well. But there was a lot of people that were like, "Oh man, Roman Reigns won again. This is a bad decision," but what have you, right? And then because of his dominance, they just assumed, "Oh well, watch, Roman Reigns will be UFC champion." I was like, that doesn't really happen. There's a lot of things that have to happen for even Roman to or Joe Anawahi is his given name, to compete in MMA. There's licenses that you have to get. He's a 30 something, late 30 something um, person, right? And some person that has battled leukemia, right, over the last decade or so, if not longer, right? So the chances of him getting cleared are slim to none. So there's that. Both on Instagram and on all the socials, but Keyboard Warriors MMA, and on Instagram, eLaw52. That's Eddie Law of the Keyboard Warriors MMA podcast. Shout out to you guys. But do you see this as a positive for both companies? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Because the thing about it is, um, if it's a positive, right? Think about the things that have been stirred up, right? I would say in wrestling since the 70s, right? Or in MMA over the last like 5 to 10 years, right? In terms of a wrestlers and or fighters union, right? So I think if the merger basically enacts something where, pro wrestlers and MMA fighters have a some sort of health plan, retirement benefits, and what have you. I think that as a net benefit for everybody involved. It's a great PR move for the company, as well as it's great for the fighters and wrestlers, that have fought in the promotion, fought or wrestled for either promotion, WWE or UFC, right? And they have more of a bargaining agreement. More wrestlers, more fighters, they come together and like, this is what we want to do. Very similar of a union. So if that happens, it's amazing, right? Now, as we saw with WrestleMania, right, there are a ton of ads. So I think this is the new normal, right? Before every match, I think before the main event, we had a TurboTax, kind of advertisement, a commercial, right? I don't know what, I haven't watched or night one or night two back on TV on Peacock. But I know in SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, and yes, it was Inglewood, folks. It wasn't Hollywood. I love the set design, but it's Inglewood, California. I grew up in Inglewood, California. There was nothing that made me more prouder. It was my first WrestleMania. I got to attend it literally a stone's throw away from where I grew up. And actually, that was the old Hollywood Park Casino. So I did, as a ROTC kind of cadet in high school, I did events at that very arena. So to think that that would be leveled out and a football stadium to be erected in my like in my adopted hometown. I was born in San Francisco, but most of my life was in Inglewood. So that was an amazing kind of happenstance that happened. So it's crazy. Mike Pedrosa says, agreed. Healthcare and retirement packages would be great for all talent. Absolutely. So that's a net benefit. Also, one of the things that has been talked about, right, is the fact that a Hall of Fame, right? Neither the WWE or the UFC has a physical Hall of Fame. Now, in recent years, we've heard things like maybe a Disney purchase that would basically have the WWE have a physical Hall of Fame and the Disney resort in Florida, right? And the same thing with NBC Universal. They were one of the names in the hunt, right, to acquire the WWE, right? Whether it was speculatory or not, we will never know who was engaged in the conversations, or maybe we do at a later date. But as of right now, we don't know. We don't know, right? But we could see a similar thing about the Hall of Fame, where much like I think it's the Fez Tragos Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa, right? They basically honor both, competitors in, combat sports and in MMA or wrestling and what have you. And also, like athletes, right? Olympic athletes. It's all in one umbrella, right? So we could see a WWE UFC Hall of Fame, or one building somewhere where you have your UFC Hall of Fame wing with all of the relics and stuff, right? And I think that's one thing that the WWE does that MMA doesn't do, is kind of honor the legends that are, right? Because if you went to WrestleMania, right, like there were shirts of the WWE Hall of Fame and what have you. So, and wrestling greats are able to go to conventions and do signings and everything based on their name, right? So I think that would be cool. And instead of like a convention, right, just everybody doing their own separate regional, like Wonder Cons or what have you, or wrestling conventions. WrestleCon just had one over the last like 3 nights, right, at the Millennium Biltmore. So there's that. So maybe we see less of that, and we see a like the signings only happen. You can meet Randy Orton at the WWE wing of the Hall of Fame here, or I don't know who the Great Muda, right? Or you can meet I wouldn't say Randy Couture, but let's say Jose Aldo, right? Jose Aldo or Anderson Silva will be signing autographs here at the Hall of Fame, at these times, right? Now, where it kind of sucks, right? Because now it's under one umbrella, right? Is we saw, if you're an MMA fan, we saw the UFC fight kits, right? And the UFC fight kits basically negated any sort of way for talent independently to make money, because there are people who were maybe mid-level UFC fighters that were making more than their fight purse, to the hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? More per fight, because they had, sponsorship logos on their t-shirts, on their shorts, almost like NASCAR, right? So if there is a physical hall of fame, and everything is under one banner, and who could say you can't do that? Because again, if you're somebody who's competed in the UFC, or somebody who's wrestled for the WWE at any point over the last, in the case of the WWE, right? Oh, we're talking Jess McMahon, Jess, Vince Senior, and now Vince, right? Like all of I think that's like over almost 100 years worth of intellectual property, right? And from Antonino Rocca, and what is it, Gorgeous George, and what have you. Anybody that has wrestled in the last 100 years in the Northeast, and later the WWF and the WWF, and now WWE, well, they own your intellectual property, right? Because when Jess McMahon was running wrestling and boxing in the Northeast, we didn't know anything. The wrestlers didn't know about intellectual property rights and what have you. So the WWE could literally spit out shirts and whatever, and none of the proceeds will go to the Rocca family, right? So there's that. And the same thing, right? Like if the UFC wanted to make, I don't know, Chuck Liddell shirts, right? They wanted to make Chuck Liddell shirts. They own his intellectual property, right? And it's a little bit weirder, because it was like his Chuck Liddell, that's his actual name, right? Charles Liddell, right? Versus, like a Roman Reigns, right? Roman Reigns is not the guy's name, right? He's Liati Joe Anoa'i, right? So if Liati Joe Anoa'i wanted to do an independent signing and what have you, that isn't under the WWE UFC umbrella, he can do it as such, right? And that's when, if you go to an independent type of autograph signing, right, it's the person's real name, formerly known as, or FKA or AKA, also known as whatever their WWE name or their wrestling name is. So there's a lot of crazy nuances that I, for one, am interested to find out how this is going to be merged, right? There goes the stock. I want to know how long. I mean, there's a difference between Dana White and Vince McMahon in terms of age, right? Where I think the vitality element are true in both, right? Where I'm not going to say that like Vince McMahon, because he's 80 years old, is any less vital than a Dana White. That's not what I'm saying at all. But does Vince McMahon have a 5-year deal with this new parent company that he stays on? What does that look like? Because I don't know the terms of the deal with Dana White, but there is some sort of thing that keeps Dana White on the payroll, right? And much like anything else, he probably gets quarterly bonuses if he does this, sells this many pay-per-views, whatever his deal may be. So Vince McMahon, who has never really had a boss since he was an announcer for his dad in the Northeast in the 70s and early 80s, right? So how is Vince McMahon going to handle being under a corporate umbrella? Well, I mean, to an extent, since the WWE went public, well, it is a corporate umbrella, right? But he has been the alpha, right? He is not anymore. He plays second fiddle to Aria Emanuel, and also Dana White has more tenure in this kind of new agreement, right? He's been under the Endevor banner since I believe it was 2017 when the UFC is purchased. So there's a lot of moving parts. And the one thing that I know for a fact that is different in terms of the UFC merger, right, or acquisition by Endevor, than the WWE, right? After UFC 200, the UFC didn't have 7 hours of live pay per view, live TV in the subsequent week after the sale, right? That is something that the WWE has. The WWE tonight has a 3 hour Raw that starts off 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I mean, they can't under the rug sweep this. This has gone into the pop culture lexicon, as I like to call it. Everybody knows it's on TMZ. It's interviews on CNBC. It's not just wrestling insiders. It's not just MMA insiders that know this news. It's everyone, right? So that's it. So WWE has 3 hours of TV tonight, an NXT show, right? And then I think two NXT shows. The main NXT show, I think, is a 2 hour show on USA Network, as well as the NXT Level Up, I believe, is an hour, and then another 2 hours for Friday Night SmackDown. So how that's going to look, is there going to be a set change? Are we going to feel any immediate developments, right, or right off the bat, or is it going to be slow and steady? I don't know. I absolutely don't know, but I'm interested and intrigued to find out. The other thing, right, is the fact that the rights fees deal, that was a major component of the WWE being sold, right? Is, they're nearing their kind of end of their contractual agreements with both Fox as well as NBC Universal, the parent company of the USA, right? So how's that going to work? Could the WWE, much like UFC, move over to an ESPN type platform? And have everything behind a paywall. Well, that won't happen immediately because the WWE sold their rights, for their WWE network and any subsequent, vintage content to NBC Universal. So we won't see that. But as a wrestling fan and as a subscriber to WWE Network and now Peacock, right? I'm used to not paying for pay-per-views. Nick Khan made a statement right before Mania, the week of Mania, that they were looking into a like a pay-per-view type scenario, right? And if you know WWE, the UFC, right? You pay whatever you pay here in North America, right? For the ESPN app, right? Then what is it, once a month, sometimes twice a month, right? But at least 12 times out of the year, there's a big UFC pay-per-view, which is an additional $80, right? And you cannot buy that a la carte. You have to be subscribed to the ESPN app, right? You have to be a member. You can't just go, order it on pay-per-view, the UFC. You have to have this, right? So do we see the WWE kind of go back to a semi-traditional for them kind of structure where you basically have your base content on Peacock Network, right? But if you want to see WrestleMania Backlash that's going to happen in Puerto Rico, you have to pay an additional $10, $20, $30 to see it, right? Now, what could happen is the content could be better, because I will say, since the WWE went behind like a WWE Network type scenario and got given everything away for free, the content might not be as optimal as it once was when you were paying what, 30, 40, $50 for a WWE pay-per-view, right? So we could see that could be a net benefit, but also your pocketbook, that's going to be positive, man. I think just in UFC events alone, right? If you had the ESPN app and ordered every UFC pay-per-view, right? I believe you're out at least $1,000 a year. And that's just in UFC. That's not any other promotion, right? So that's where we are, so we are uncharted in unprecedented times and uncharted waters. We don't know. And there, at least to my knowledge, maybe to a different extent, I believe it's Anthem up in Canada that owns the Fight Network, right? They acquired both Impact Wrestling and Invicta, which is the premier all female women's MMA promotion. So with that all being said, I've never seen a cross promotion for Impact Wrestling, you know, on Invicta, right, on their YouTube streams, nor have I seen anything on Impact that would lead you back to um, Invicta, right, the MMA, because maybe they believe that, there's two separate, fan bases that might not intertwine, right? But we've got Endeavor, Hollywood, UFC, MMA, and the WWE, right? So I know everybody is going to want to dip into the other's fan base. So I'm just saying, this is unprecedented times. I think we're going to see, whatever the next UFC pay per view is going to be. That's going to be probably littered with advertisements for the WWE, either Monday Night Raw or their next. They call it the premium live event because it's not no longer pay per view because you don't pay for the view anymore. But I think that terminology will be gone. That was kind of coined by Stephanie McMahon. When she was on the board of directors, she's no longer there. Right? We saw the return of Shane McMahon, right, Vince's son, to WrestleMania, and unfortunately, he tore his quad, but maybe this is somebody that was kind of, at least we believe, was kind of excommunicated from the family and the company for antics that he played at a particular Royal Rumble. Like he booked it and he made himself look strong. It's a whole weird thing, right? But maybe that was Shane coming back and he's like, this is the last pay per view that is going to be under my family's ownership, an ownership that has basically been 100 years old. And let me just do this one more time. Feel that crowd one more time. And he ends up, tearing his quad. It's an unfortunate deal, but he knew something that we didn't, So I'm just saying, Roman Reigns won against Cody Rhodes last night, right? Well, Roman Reigns, right, has been in Fast and the Furious movies. He has an eye to Hollywood. A bridge that was forged by guys like, Hulk Hogan. He kind of made inroads to Hollywood, but in the past we've got Stone Cold Steve Austin, Roddy Piper, and of course The Rock, right? As well as Dave Bautista, who's rumored to be in this year's Hall of Fame, but it didn't happen. So these are guys that have made inroads to Hollywood. Well, if you're Roman Reigns or any other WWE talent and UFC talent to an extent, if you've got one foot in with stars in your eyes and you want to do something else, well, you can do it in-house because you could be represented by Endeavor and basically end up in movies and what have you. And all the while, you're still, fulfilling your commitments as a UFC fighter or a WWE superstar. So again, a lot of moving parts, but I just wanted to kind of get on and see what you guys think about it. Thank you guys for joining us. And if you haven't already done so, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to the According to Woods podcast on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Also, the bodyslam.net family of channels. A lot of amazing content in both pro wrestling, MMA, and the world over. So check out bodyslam.net. I'm According to Woods. Actually, we got one last thing before we go. In the words of Hoobastank, it's only an evolution of combat. So it says Charles the Professor Wilton. The UFC started off as a form of the WWE kind of a system. No, 100% with the, they couldn't fill arenas in the early days. So they had lavish kind of entrance ways, very reminiscent of pro wrestling. But if you look at the old school system, and this system is boxing, MMA and backyard boxing organizations, they are growing due to business deals like this. It even helps my sport grow. And for those who don't know, Charles the Professor Wilton is a wheelchair boxer up in Canada, and he's trying to gain legalization. Similarly, the type of kind of fight and campaign that Dana White once forged in the early days of the UFC, So, yeah. Mari Yamasaki, see you guys. And if you haven't already done so, go ahead and subscribe to the Keyboard Warriors MMA podcast. If not for them, I wouldn't be doing this to this extent. So shout out to Eddie Law as well as Fred Kirby, and thank you guys. Yeah, have a great day. There's a lot of stuff going around, but don't let it get you into a negative headspace. This is all good, all good. This is talent, fans of either sport, either entertainment. We get to just love what we love together. Now then, together forever. Right? That was the WWE's tagline. So there's that. But you guys are awesome. Again, subscribe to the podcast. And if you don't believe me, I don't know why you wouldn't. For the folks over on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, here's Zeta Zhang. And then Instagram, I'll close you guys out manually. But have a great day, guys.
Hey, this is Zeta Zhang. Make sure you subscribe to According to Woods YouTube.